Now, the photographers get ready, please. We have a last prize to be awarded, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you my dear friend and colleague, Edward Stringham, who is a economist now with San Jose State University, and is a leading mind of the new generation of Austrian economics, the ones who were produced by Pete Betke at GMU in cooperation with some other Austrian professors. In Edward's case, that was Professor Walter Block, and Ed is extremely well published in both Austrian and mainstream journals, and I would say he is a great promise for the Austrian movement. I only wish that GMU produces more people such as Ed, because then the future of Austrian economics will be bright. Now let me award Edward the 2005 Murray Rothbard Prize for Distinguished Young Scholars for advancing Austrian economics and radical scholarship. Edward, thank you. Thank you, Joseph.
I'm honored to be here. I want to just say that you've done a magnificent job with this entire conference, and I hope to be winning this award every year from now on.
No problem.
But seriously, I think what you're doing here with the Liberal Institute is great, and this conference, it's just an amazing success to me. In the first year, having well over 100 people, I think it's just a great thing. So I want to thank you, and I hope everyone thanks him and all the other people here afterwards. Just to do a little bit of self-advertising, since I love talking about myself, if anybody has the opportunity to come to the U.S., I am the Vice President and the President-elect of the Association of Private Enterprise Education, and we have a conference next April in Las Vegas. And so from a purely self-interested standpoint, the more people who attend, the better I look. So I don't really care about you, but just in terms of me looking good, the more people who come, the better. And I want to have as many Austrians and hardcore libertarians there as possible. So if you want to email me about that, I can provide you the more details. The theme of the conference is Private Solutions to Market Failures. Is government always the answer? But I guess the sub-theme should be, is government ever the answer? So that is something that might be of interest to you. As you might know, I live in the San Francisco area, and also who lives in the San Francisco area is Milton Friedman. And just Friday of last week, he was giving a talk in Palo Alto, and he needed a ride to the talk, and so this other gentleman drove, and I was in the car with him for over an hour. And the part that many of you might find interesting is I asked him the following question. I said, excluding yourself, who are the top 5 most important people for liberty in the 20th century? Okay, so who are the top 5 most important people for liberty in the 20th century? Does anyone have a guess who Mr. Chicago said? Just some names who might be on the list. Joseph, do you have any guesses of who might be included?
No.
How about from the audience? Any guesses?
Mike, Fisher, Keynes, Rothbard.
Okay, Fisher, Keynes. Few guesses. Actually, I did hear a couple guesses, and his answer really surprised me. He said, quote, without a doubt, the most important people for liberty in the 20th century were 1. Friedrich Hayek, 2. Ludwig von Mises, 3. Ayn Rand, 4. Henry Hazlitt, and then he had to think for a few minutes, and for number 5 he said, oh, George Stigler. So as an Austrian, I was very happy to hear his response. 3 out of the top 4 were Austrians, and Ayn Rand, who's, although not an economist, she had some affinities with the Austrian school, and she was an ideological supporter of free markets compared to the quasi-free market efficiency people associated with Chicago. I was very glad he didn't mention someone like Richard Posner or one of my former professors, the statist Gordon Tullock. So I was very, very pleased by that. So overall, I thought the list was pretty good. But one thing was interesting, I thought, about the list. Out of all of the top 5 people on his list, and including Milton Friedman himself, all 5, and then Milton Friedman, all 6 believe that the necessary function of government, one of the necessary functions of government, is the enforcement of contracts. Okay, so although all these guys are the leading free market economists, they have great skepticism of government in the economy elsewhere, very critical of different government interventions. They believe that in the area of law, government action is needed. And I'm going to be referring to these groups of people, by the way, as classical liberals. I know in Europe, liberals mean something else. But I'm referring to them as classical liberals as opposed to libertarians who have different views. These classical liberals believe that because the enforcement of contracts is so necessary for society, they believe that the government must fill this role. So despite government shortcomings elsewhere, these classical liberals believe that the government has a necessary and legitimate role to play when dealing with force and fraud. Now, I, in contrast, believe that because the enforcement of contracts is so important, it's the last thing that we should be leaving to government. I believe the classical liberals are guilty of the same sin committed by so many others who they have criticized. So the classical liberals are correct to criticize different statists who think of a potential or an existing problem, and they say, okay, I imagine this problem in the world. Okay, government's going to solve it. The classical liberals have done a great service in saying, look, thinking something so or wishing something so doesn't mean that it is so. Okay, so believing the government can solve the problem is not enough. And so I believe that, and the correct economists in my position believe that government often has problems. Okay, government often lacks incentives to solve a problem, often lacks the knowledge to solve a problem, and in many cases, government attempts to solve problems may have unintended consequences that are worse than no solution at all. Okay, so maybe it's just better to have the problem. Okay, and in addition, many of the advocates of government often fail to consider the ability of markets to come up with private solutions to these alleged market failures. And UCLA economist Harold Demsetz has called this the nirvana approach to public policy. You think of a problem and you say, oh, government must solve it. So I believe right now that despite their positive contributions elsewhere, so Mises, he's not a bad guy, I guess. I don't hate him. Mises, Hayek, Hazlitt, Rand, Stigler, Friedman, despite their positive contributions elsewhere, I believe them, as well as other classical liberals, are committing their nirvana fallacy. Not only do I believe that their beliefs are intellectually wrong, I believe that their beliefs actually have led to a number of misguided policies. So they're academics, but I do believe their beliefs have led to another number of misguided policies that people like you guys have had to deal, and me, have had to deal with the results of these bad ideas. Specifically in the stock markets, I have a paper on the Czech stock market. I believe that a lot of the problems are a direct consequence of a misguided trust in government's ability to effectively adjudicate contracts. So given that a misguided faith in government anywhere can lead to disastrous policies. I think it behooves us libertarians to go out into the real world and do studies to help illustrate whether this theory of government being so good is either correct or incorrect. So whenever, in my opinion, a classical liberal says, I believe in free markets, but, or, government needs to do this, I think that as a crazy libertarian, I think that we should be following them around and saying, really, do you have proof of that? And personally, what I've been devoting my career to and what I want to keep doing is just writing as many articles as possible to illustrate the idea about whether markets can work independently of the government. Okay, so what's the issue? I can handle this one. Thanks, Doug. Always helping me out. That's good. All right, I don't want anyone to think I'm a deviationist here. I'm not a game theorist, but basically, just in terms of the simple game theory, which I don't even use or support. But basically, the issue is there's many prisoners' dilemmas in the world. Everybody here knows what a prisoner's dilemma is, and the idea is that without external enforcement, even though a trade would be mutually beneficial, there's going to be incentive for one or more parties to cheat. So with a simple transaction, you don't really necessarily even need external enforcement. If you're just at the market and you exchange two goods instantly, you don't really even need external enforcement. But whenever you have like a long-term contract, a promise to pay somebody in the future, you've got to actually rely on him following through with the bargain when the time comes due. So there's many potential issues for fraud. Stock markets, a prime example. People might engage in a contract today, and the settlement date might not be for 3 days or 3 months. And if someone says, oh, by the way, I forgot, we didn't make this contract. If you have no recourse against that person, the person can deny making the transaction, and it's all going to fall apart. So it's basically a prisoner's dilemma, and the theory is that people are going to engage in less trade than they would have otherwise. The standard solution for a prisoner's dilemma is for the government to step in and to assure that all parties follow through with their words. So the classical liberal says all that the government is going to do is to prevent each party from engaging in fraud, and that has the potential of making each party better off. Richard Epstein, famous classical liberal, says, under its classical liberal formation, the great social contract sacrifices liberty, but only to the extent that it is necessary to gain security against force and fraud. Perhaps we might go further, but surely we must go this far. Law becomes critical to offer a secure framework for these voluntary transactions to take place. He says that one would be a naive visionary to believe that markets could operate on their own volition without any kind of support from the state. And this position is very influential. Ed Glaser and Andre Schleifer of Harvard have done a lot of studies of Eastern Europe and have a lot of recommendations about transition, especially with stock markets since the collapse of communism. And they argue in a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, they say that a well-functioning stock market, quote, crucially relies on the possibility of effective enforcement of complicated contracts. So their policy conclusion for Eastern Europe is you either need an effective judiciary or diligent government regulators to make sure people refrain from fraud. Okay? You need one of those two things. And they actually in this piece conclude that because there's not really an effective judiciary in Eastern Europe, they say you need government regulators to enforce the rules. and this is the standard view in all of the academic articles. Pretty much everybody says this, that you need to have, the government needs to devise a system of strong rules, a strong enforcement system, if you want to see the emergence of a market. Okay, so the question I want to ask is, how solid is the classical liberal case for laws against fraud? What evidence do the classical liberals provide that government has the capability of solving the problem? And what evidence do they provide to show that markets are incapable of solving the problem? And I actually did find their evidence. Took me a long time, but I did find their evidence. This is the evidence. That in many cases is just an assumption, okay? They don't actually prove it theoretically. They don't prove it empirically. It's just an assertion, really. My favorite economist, Murray Rothbard, and other libertarian economists have questioned this idea, whether in theory government needs to enforce contracts. Now, external enforcement is one way to ensure that contracts are upheld, but there may be other ways. Okay, there might be other ways of ensuring contractual performance. So the most obvious, the one that requires the least imagination, is private enforcement. Okay, if you need courts to enforce contracts, well, why do you need public courts? Why don't you just have private courts? And with arbitration and things like that, it's very easy to just say, okay, we're making this contract, we need a court, we're going to sign a private arbitration agreement. And in the U.S., at least, most contracts have private arbitration agreements. So the idea that this can't be handled privately, it's just puzzling to me. If people are worried that a private court would be unable to exact fines, there's numerous solutions that libertarians have come up with. Just the simple idea, both parties can post a bond with the arbitration agency or bonding agency that says, if you default or you don't want to follow through with your contract, the bonding agency will just give part of the money to the wrong party. So you don't even need the threat of force involved. At a more basic level, there's many other possible mechanisms that people can use to make sure people abide by their contracts. And to me, that's some of the more interesting things. The idea that you might not even need rules at all. Even back in early Adam Smith's writing, he talks about the discipline of continuous dealings, which is basically the idea, if you're dealing with someone many times, or you want to deal with people over and over again, I cheat every time I see Joseph. I always cheat with him, but he still talks to me. But usually, when you cheat on someone once in a transaction, they say, I'm not going to deal with you anymore. And most businesses are in it for the long term, and they have an incentive to follow through with their word. John Locke, other economists have talked about the importance of religion or implicit morality. If someone is just moral, I think most people, or some people, are just moral and they don't want to cheat people even though they could get away with it. And there's a whole number of other sanctions that people can use to create contractual performance. And one of the more important ones, morality aside, is the idea of reputation. So I might not be coming to the Czech Republic ever again until next year. But if people can talk about your reputation and spread your reputation everywhere, it's a way of making sure that people are trustworthy. And in my opinion, there's many potential solutions. I've just mentioned a couple. I think there's probably 1,000 potential solutions. I'd like to see a list of 1,000 potential solutions and then say, okay, if each one of these 1,000 things don't work, maybe we can start thinking about the need for external enforcement. Okay, but I think that's more productive than saying, and I don't even support government enforcement at all, but I think that's more productive than saying, okay, yes, let's just assume government needs to enforce contracts. And today I just want to show you one example of some work that I've done on this topic, just to illustrate the idea that government is not the only answer, and that markets oftentimes do work quite effectively without any external enforcement. So today I want to talk about my findings on my research on the emergence of the world's first stock market. And the question I have is, was it the case that the world's first stock market only emerged after strong enforcement of contracts? And when I started doing research on this topic, it became clear to me that the answer was no. Markets emerged first and started functioning and flourishing, and it was only later that government came in and said, yes, we need to enforce contracts. Okay? Many years later, and now people say, yes, government created the first stock market. That's the standard view. I was at a conference at Stanford just a few months ago, and Doug North and all these people were there like, well, of course you need the government to create stock markets. And I'm like, excuse me, I wrote my dissertation about this. I'd like to ask you some questions. Okay, so that's my goal, is to see whether classical liberals are correct about the need for government enforcement of contracts. My method is to do a case study of the world's first stock market. Does anyone know where it was? Where this is? Anybody good at maps?
London? Amsterdam.
Close, all right. I've got some Dutch people here, okay. This is Amsterdam in the 17th century. I do have there's another article I have about London, which is really brilliant. But I'm going to talk about my paper about Amsterdam today. And just do a case study of the Amsterdam Bourse of the 17th century. I'm going to review the legal and the regulatory climate and look into an old book from Amsterdam, which is translated into English, thankfully, and to see the practices of the stock market. Okay, the first stock market, basically the first company which might be considered a modern corporation was in the 1500s in England, the Muscovy Company. But the first company which was really traded in the world at a large scale was the Dutch East India Company in Amsterdam, which was founded right around 1600. Initially, before this, people had to make their own investments, which was very risky if you're putting all your eggs in one basket. But what happened with the Dutch East India Company was many people got together and pooled their resources and said, look, I can't afford all of these ships, but I can afford a share of these ships. And so what they did was they got a few thousand investors, 3,000 investors actually, from different parts of Holland, and they said, would you like to contribute money to its venture? And so it was mostly rich people who got involved, but later on there was some lower income people. I wanted to have a picture of one of the investors from the company, but I couldn't find any, so I just got a picture of some random guy from Holland. Actually, this guy was the architect of the Amsterdam Bourse. It's not entirely random. The company was created, and for the first 10 years, it paid no dividends. Before that, also, the other thing was companies You would invest in it. The ships would go out. The ships would come in, and then the company would be disbanded. So it was just a venture. This company, after 10 years, for the first 10 years, it's kept reinvesting the profits and say, okay, we got ships coming back. Let's reinvest them. And it started reinvesting profits. And by the 11th and 12th year, the dividends were equal to the initial investment. So 100% return over 10 years. That's pretty good. And the shares became enduring after a short amount of time. By 1609, people said if you wanted to cash out of the company, you needed to actually sell your shares. In the original days, you would have to go to the office of the company and say, okay, I'd like to transfer this share to so-and-so, and he would give you money, and it was this long procedure. The company was not really set up for this, okay? It's not like, one of these websites where you go to and say, please buy this at this price. So it was kind of a hassle. And so what happened was these brokers, these intermediaries started emerging and say, look, if you make the deal with us, we will handle the transaction, we'll give you the money, and in 3 months we will settle the trade. The trading took place on the Amsterdam Bourse, which was one of the first exchanges. It's big enough to hold 500 people, and they traded all types of things in there: whale oil, grain, herring, tulips, and the stockbrokers began occupying a section of the bourse, and they started creating different types of deals that people could have. They created settlement days, at which time all bargains could either be adjusted or continued to the next settlement, and this enabled people to avoid the whole process of going to the company and paying them a fee to transfer the shares. The stock market had around, I would say, in the 1600s, about 100 brokers overall, and there was a guild, but the market was, from what I can tell, pretty open. There was they said, as many as 500 unlicensed brokers at different points. The popularity of the stock market rose with the good fortune of the East India Company, which was significant over a 100-year period. Investment, if you'd gotten in early, you would have received annual dividends of 22.5%. So that's pretty good. If you got in later, like towards the end here, you're still getting, on average, annual dividends of 5%, which is pretty good. And by 1688, the company had over 3,000 ships traveling between East Indies, and over 20,000 employees. So that was the major company. There's another company called the West East India Company. That was formed in a similar manner. And it was about the same size, but it had difficulties earning profits. You can see the stock price of this. I did some econometrics in my dissertation, and I did find that this is tracking exactly my computer technology mutual fund that I invested in 2 years ago. Now, in some ways, that's prettier. I'll let you look at that. In some ways, the stock market was not heavily regulated and left to its own devices, but officially, the government was not laissez-faire. They permitted the most straightforward contracts, but it was not tolerant of everything that went on at the bourse. The government viewed the market and its various types of transactions with suspicion. So since medieval times, there were laws passed to stamp out speculation, which they thought would prevent hoarding, guarantee supplies, restrict the role of the middleman. And early on in the 1600s, the brokers started engaging in pretty interesting contracts, including forward contracts and short sales. And the government looked at this and they're like, I don't think I like this. And in 1608, the price of the stock fell from 200 down to 130, and they attributed this to short sellers. And so what they did is they passed a law in 1610 prohibiting selling in blanco. They called this trading in wind, which said only people who owned shares could engage in sales. And they also said that if you engage in a contract, you must transfer it to a person within 2 weeks. Otherwise, you are violating the law. So, yes, if you trade within 2 weeks, it's legal, but pretty much everything else is not legal. In the following decades, the prohibitions continued. They added additional ordinances in 1621, 1623, 1624, 1630, 1636, 1677. And to me, what does that indicate? It indicates that even though there were these laws, the market was not being stamped out completely. Otherwise, there would not be a need for additional ordinances. So pronouncing something illegal is one thing, but what they did in Amsterdam was they said the contracts are just simply outside the law. And so they said, if you engage in this contract, you cannot have it enforced in government courts. That was basically the rule. They didn't go around punishing people. Excuse me. So if you engaged in the trade, you wouldn't be sent to jail. But it was something which was technically illegal and outside the law. So here's the law. We know that people can engage in these trades. I've got some documentation of this in the original paper. And then the question is, if the classical liberal theory is correct that you need government enforcement of contracts, you would say, okay, you can't have these types of contracts. And one of my favorite things was I found a quote by Gordon Tullock, and he was one of my professors, and I got this quote from him. He said, "Transactions in which credit are important would be impossible without external enforcement." So I put this up when I presented it at George Mason, and I was like, I'm going to investigate whether this is true, and then I just spent the entire next hour making fun of him. So what I do is I found this book. I don't have the slide with me, but there's this book which was published in 1688 called Confusion de Confusiones, by Joseph Penso de la Vega, who was a Sephardic stockbroker and writer. The book was in Spanish, but there's translations of it in Dutch and English, a couple other languages. It was composed in the form of a dialogue between three characters, with one character who is usually the vehicle for the pronouncement of the author's judgments. And the idea behind the book, people speculate, is that it was kind of written as a manual for his fellow Sephardic stockbrokers to say, okay, this is how the stock market works. So you've got one character say, how do short sales work? And then the other character says, short sales work this way, et cetera, et cetera. So it's got some kooky stuff in it, but overall it's a very, very informative book. And so I just want to read from you, from the book, some quotes just to show how the actual market was working. So the first thing he talks about in the book is short sales. He mentions that they are prohibited. He says, and this is just a quote, he says, Frederick Henry, a shining star in the House of Orange-Nassau, promulgated an ordinance with wise motives for these provinces, according to which he who sold shares for future delivery without putting them on a time account should be exposed to a danger that the buyer will not take the pieces at the time fixed upon. So short sales were de jure illegal, so we might assume that there would be no short sales taking place, but based on the text, it's clear that the ordinance did not stamp out these short sales. Vega describes, the guy's name is Joseph Penso de la Vega, describes how people engaged in short sales but would be tempted not to follow through with their bargain if the price took an unfavorable turn. Okay, you sell short, the price goes up, and then people would be tempted to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, that was an illegal transaction. I don't want to break the law." He says, there are persons who refer to the decree which proclaims the unenforceability of short sales only when compelled to do so, only if unforeseen losses occur to them in their operations. And in that case, they would call it appealing to Frederick. Okay? Frederick says it's illegal. But if everybody did this, we wouldn't see these types of transactions taking place. And we see that's not the case. He says, when a loss occurs, the losers are expected to pay at least what they have available at the moment, and it might be expected that when the wound is fresh, there be no new injury. Other people gradually fulfill their obligations after having sold their last valuables and thus meet with punctuality the reverses of misfortune. So despite the ability of short sellers to call upon the law to get out of their predicaments, people are actually following through with their words. And I just want to say that it's kind of interesting. I know Adam Smith is kind of a statist and not an Austrian, according to Murray Rothbard, but he did have some good quotes on this subject where he said this exact same thing. He said, why do people follow through with their contracts? He says, this is a quote from Adam Smith. He says, of all the nations in Europe, the Dutch, the most commercial, are the most faithful to their word. And he says, this is not at all to be imputed to national character, as some pretend. It is far more reducible to self-interest, that general principle which regulates the action of every man. He says, a dealer is afraid of losing his character and is scrupulous in observing every engagement. When a person makes 20 contracts in a day, he cannot gain so much by endeavoring to impose on his neighbors, as the very appearance of a cheat would make him lose. So this is the idea explained here. And actually, he does mention in lectures on jurisprudence how selling of certain types of financial contracts were illegal, but nonetheless people would follow through with their word. Okay, so we see short sales. We also see forward contracts in Amsterdam. These were negotiated with settlement dates months in advance. Certain times it appears there were settlement dates more than months in advance, and Vega described them pretty clearly in his book. He says, the third type of transaction takes place at later dates still. He says, here the shares must be delivered and paid for on the 20th of the month, which is specified in the contract. For these bargains, the brokers use printed contract forms with customary stipulations and conditions of the business. On these forms, spaces are left for the names, the dates, and the prices. 2 copies have been filled out and signed. He says the contracts are then exchanged by the 2 parties, and later, after the establishment of the profit or loss in the business, they are re-exchanged by the signatories. So here we have a case where they were very explicit in their contracts, and we would assume, if we were a classical liberal, we would assume that if you go to the courts and say, please enforce this contract, they will do this. But from the text, we can see this is clearly not the case. He says, as to the unactionable feature of any speculative transaction to be settled by the payment of differences, you are right in remarking that with cash transactions, the regulation lacks pertinence. It is, however, valid in the case of time bargains unless the seller has the shares transferred to the time account of the purchaser within a fortnight. Though the opinion prevails generally that this regulation does not apply in the case of the seller, but only in the case of the buyer, this is an error introduced by bad practice. The lawyers assert that the seller, as well as the buyer, is allowed to raise the objection by Frederick Henry and say, this is an illegal transaction. He says, if I have bought a share at $5.40 and sell him another share at 520, without subsequent declaration before witnesses that the stock so sold will serve to settle the account of my shares previously purchased, I need neither declare myself bankrupt in order to free myself from the obligation, nor disappear in order to shake loose. I can merely appeal to the edict. So he says that you can actually just call upon the law and say, yeah, I don't want to pay. But again, if we look at what actually was happening in the market, even though you didn't have to pay, people didn't follow the law, and they ended up going along with their words. Okay, the next contract, which I found especially interesting. Does anyone know when options were invented? 1600s. I thought the options were invented in the 1970s. I was born in the 1970s, so I'm like, yeah, options must have been invented in the 1970s. Well, options were invented in the 17th century, so I was only off by a few hundred years. And they had this very sophisticated form of trading in Amsterdam, despite their uncertain legal standing. He says here too, the regulations only added confusion to the business of options because it was unsure how they applied. He says, as to whether the regulation is applicable to options contracts, the opinions of experts diverge widely. I have not found any decision that might serve as precedent. All experts hold the regulation is applicable to both the seller and the buyer. In practice, however, the judges have often decided differently, always freeing the buyer from the liability, while often holding the seller to the contract. Okay, so some people have to pay, some people don't have to pay. He says, with regard to the put premium, there are great differences of opinion. For while the scholars assume that no legally valid claims can be made because of the regulation, there are contrary decisions by the courts, so that the law and legal opinion, the regulation and the reasons for the decisions are contradictory. The theory remains uncertain, and no one can tell which way adjudication tends. Okay, so whatever the case may be, it seems that the options market was developing independently of the law. Okay, it's not like, oh, the judges are so smart, let's tell people how to engage in these option contracts. The judges have no idea what options contracts were. Okay, other things going on in Amsterdam. By the late 1600s, the price of a share was about 15,000 guilders, and the average laborer was making 1 guilder per day. Okay, so you're not going to be able to buy a full share. In modern times, you're going to see stock splits or stock dividends, different things like this. But at the time, the East India Company had not figured this out or thought of this yet. But still, these traders and brokers figured out a way of introducing the stock market to more people. He says, quote, some clerks have discovered that speculating in ordinary shares, which are called large or paid-up shares, was too hazardous for their slight resources. They began, therefore, a less daring game in which they dealt in small shares. For while the whole shares one could win or lose 30 gulden of bank money for every point the price rose or fell, with the small shares one risked only a ducaton, which is a small coin in Netherlands. He says the new speculation called trading in ducatan shares began in 1683. So basically what they did was they said, all right, here's one I'm not going out of order here with my denied hypothecation. It's securitization. What they did was they said, we're going to take one large share and we're going to split it up into 10 small shares or 100 small shares. And he describes how they did this, how it's basically like taking a mirror and breaking it into many different pieces. He says this has made speculation in the market so popular. He says this branch of trade has been increasing during the last 5 years to such an extent, and mainly with a certain group which is as boisterous as it is quick-witted, that it is engaged by both sexes, old men, women, and children. Vega wrote, even children who hardly know the world and at best own a little pocket money agree that at each point by which the large shares rise or fall will mean a certain amount of their pocket money for their small shares. If one were to lead a stranger through the streets of Amsterdam and ask him where he is, he would say, among speculators. For there is no corner in this city where one does not talk shares. Okay, and I'm going to skip hypothecation. Hypothecation is just you can use your equities as collateral for a loan, and if the price of the shares start going down too much, you're not going to be able to pay your loan, so people would have to actually cash out the transaction. And in that area too, it was illegal to engage in hypothecation. They still did it, and it was quite successful. Okay, so from the examples given, we can see that official regulations were outlawing whole markets. They were not assisting them. For such extra-legal markets to function, there must have existed some other mechanism to ensure contractual performance. And to me, the interesting thing, it was not even private law enforcement. There was no private courts involved. It was just basically incentives created by a reputational network. Other people have talked about the importance of religious sanctions or social sanctions. Here it seems just clear that people wanted to follow their words because they wanted to have a good reputation on the market. And we can see evidence in the book of this in many ways. He talks about how many people are allowed to come into the market, but only those who establish a good reputation can get business. He says there exists an infinite number of these free brokers. The occupation is, in many cases, the only recourse for impoverished businessmen and the best place of refuge for many ruined careers. But the issue is when you've got so many people entering the market, how do you know who to trust? How do you know who not to trust? There's no law you can rely on. One guy in the book, he says, I don't think I could get into the market because my limited capital would preclude me from engaging in exchange. He said there would be nobody to give me credit. And in response, the other people say to him, they say, oh, look, start with options. Okay, you don't need to risk a lot of money with options. And he says, they say, do that, and quote, until you gain in reputation for generosity as well as foresight. Okay, so the longer you're in the market, the more people can trust you, the more you develop your reputation. And there's lots of evidence for this. He writes, the exchange business is comparable to a game. Some of the players behave like princes and combine strength with tenderness, amiability with intelligence. But there are some participants who lose their reputation and others who lack devotion to the business before the play begins. Since the status, the insignificant capital, the low reputation, and limited trustworthiness of such people are well known, they do not dare attempt to carry on any considerable business. So you had to work to get customers. If you're a broker, you can't just say, come to me, come to me. People could show up and make their own trades, and if you want to deal with a broker, you got to make sure that he's a good guy. And Vega writes, he says, so great is the loyalty of some brokers to their principals, whom they usually call their masters, and so great is their industry, their activity, their zeal, and their vigilance, that the customers usually get their money's worth. Here's a picture. This can't really see it, but that guy kind of looks like Joseph. So because of reputation, you've got positive incentives for contractual performance, and I just want to read this one last paragraph. He says, to be sure, there is widespread honesty and expedition on the exchange. For example, the business in stocks and the bustle of sales which are made when unforeseen news arrives is wonderful to behold. Nobody changes the decisions which he makes in his momentary passions, and his words are held sacred, even in the case of a price difference of 50%. And although tremendous business is done by the merchants without the mediation of brokers who could serve as witnesses, no confusion occurs and no quarrels take place. Such honesty, cooperation, and accuracy are admirable and surprising. So, in such an anarchic market, it was not an option for people to rely on the courts to enforce contracts, but nevertheless, the bargains were kept. So, contrary to the idea that government is needed for the enforcement of contracts, one would be a naive visionary to believe that markets can work without external enforcement. I believe that this is just one of many examples that show that markets can function without external enforcement. And personally, when I think about the world, when I first read Bruce Benson's book, I thought, this is great. He shows all these markets that work without government. And I thought, but he already wrote about the few examples already. So there's nothing else to be written. Well, now I look at the world, I'm like, there's a million examples, a million articles waiting to be written. And if we can just go around documenting, 1,000 different ways of solving the problem, 1,000 different examples of each one, and then the next time Milton Friedman says, of course the government needs to enforce contracts, we can say, Article 593 says it doesn't. So the government advocates at that point, they might have to come up with a more complicated theory of why private solutions are suboptimal, okay? But at that point, they're not going to be able to say private contract enforcement is impossible. And if Austrian economics has taught me anything, it's that government is not as perfect as many people believe, and that markets do work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Now everybody sees or can see why Ed was given this Murray Rothbard Prize for Radical Scholarship. I hope he will come back to Prague a million times and each time bring us a new example of private solution to problems and conflict resolutions. We have few minutes for questions or comments, so please, whoever wants to add something or ask a question.
I take that to mean that you thought my talk was brilliant, and I thank you all.
Well, this was an example of a really successful enterprise. I'm Dutch, so I can be proud that if things have failed and the expeditions have failed and the money was flowing in, in any case, you needed somehow, sometimes you need a judge when people don't live up to their contracts. You say that in the United States there is this, what's it called, internal regulation of contracts. I do see that it's private law, contract is private law, that is clear enough. But this is really a very good example. There might be examples that are not so successful.
I think that's a good point, and I'm not claiming that every market without external enforcement is always going to work 100% perfectly. But if this is the first stock market, I think it's quite important. The second stock market, London, I've done another paper about that, and that also evolved privately. So I do agree that one can think of a case of where it might be possible that a market transaction might result in fraud. Okay, I'm not denying that, but it's like, what's the relative comparison? This one guy, when I was on the job market a few years ago, came up with this criticism of me. I had the job in the bag, already, so it was okay that I was rude to him. But basically, he had spent some time in Kazakhstan and things like that, and he was telling me what a disaster it was. And he goes to me after I present my thesis. He's like, yeah, no, it can't work without government enforcement. He goes, one word for you, Enron. Okay, so people follow this, big fraud in the U.S. And I go to him, I go, one word for you, Kazakhstan. So it's like, yeah, there's problems in the market, but what are we comparing it to? What's the alternative? And I think in the Czech Republic, the alternative is an unregulated market or a bunch of regulators who have no idea what they're doing. Or in the U.S., it's an unregulated market, or the New York Attorney General, Eliot Spitzer, dragging innocent stockbrokers to jail. I'll side with the unregulated market.
Yes, Christian.
You've given us a very good example of something that operates a bit like a club, where people know each other and they are known, they are part of the community, and so on. And enforcement in this case can be made by all what we have said, reputation, and so on. Have you done any work, or do you plan to do any work, of enforcement of contracts or relationships between strangers?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I have 2 edited volumes forthcoming about anarchism, which you all should buy. One of them is with Edward Elgar, the other one's with Transaction. And I think there's many different ways of solving the problem. So as you correctly point out, when you know people, you've got basically club rules, informal rules. When you start going in large distance, you've got to come up with other private solutions. And in international trade, you've got a whole bunch of different types of agreements. So, the bonding issues, or credit cards, I think, are a great example. How does my hotel know that I'm going to pay them? How do they know that I'm a nice person? Well, they don't know, but they know that I have a MasterCard or a Visa, and that's all that you need. So you can have networks that help transmit reputation. So there's many solutions.
Since you mentioned Walter Bluff as one of your teachers, he considers, and given the fact that you consider reputation one of the basic blocks for unregulated markets, how do you react to his proposal that reputation is something that you can destroy quite legitimately at will? And this was one of the arguments I had with him. Yeah, no,
it's an interesting debate, and I enjoyed both sides of the debate. And actually, in London, when I was doing my research in the London stock market, there was a guy who they published a whole little monograph in response to the London Stock Exchange, some other London Stock Exchange members who had sullied their reputation. So they were like, look, you ruined my reputation, this is horrible, you guys are bad people, you're liars, and you've harmed me. And I think the solution, which I hope will be consistent with Walter Block's and your position, is when you have a private club, you can create whatever rules you want in that private club. So if someone makes a false charge against someone, you might have a private rule that deals with that. And I know with the diamond merchants in New York City, they do have rules about that. That if you have a false charge against someone and it damages their reputation, they will require the person who makes the false charge to make a public apology and to donate money to charity. So I think that would be a way of dealing with these types of issues.
But that's a bit of a fairy tale ending, because normally if you want to harm somebody, you take somebody outside the club to do actual...
I don't see why, if all I care about is reputation in the Amsterdam Bourse, and then these people out there have a bad opinion about me, I don't see why that matters to me. Or if Visa and MasterCard know that I'm a good risk, I don't care if someone on the street says, I don't trust you with my money. All that matters is if you can find some people who can trust you. So I would say the main point of my research, which I would like to emphasize, is you don't need solutions to all possible problems imaginable. You just need solutions to problems at the margin that you're dealing with.